Hey, welcome to Our Defining Moments. I'm your host, Mary McClements. In this podcast, I talk with people about the split-second moments in their lives that sent them in directions that they never expected. From the woods of Vermont to the streets of San Francisco to the Camino de Santiago in Spain, you may be astonished by the chain reactions these moments have had not only for my guests, but for those around them. Hello there. Today on Our Defining Moments, or ODM for short, I get to hang out with a pro musician who specializes in banjo, Jake Schepps. Jake's defining moment came at a fairly young age when life was pretty uncertain for him. Jake also runs a nonprofit called Round Window Institute, which offers professional development music camps for musicians. And Round Window Institute also publishes banjo tablature for players, which he's actually going to describe this correctly in a few moments. Jake also has released 4 records and has been featured on NPR, WNYC, has had a Tiny Desk concert, and changing years. For 20 years, Jake was a senior staff field instructor at NOLS, which stands for the National Outdoor Leadership School, and has taught wilderness medicine courses around the world. And holy cow, that's a lot. Welcome, Jake.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Thank you for being here. So that was a pretty long list of things about you. And I definitely slaughtered the part about Round Window Institute description on the books that you create. Can you describe that correctly, please?
Sure. We're creating basically banjo transcription books for, as we say, further the art of the 5-string banjo. So it's mostly original music by artists like Bela Fleck, who's a little more a household name of banjo players, but other kind of up-and-coming players, stuff that's composed for solo banjo, so that's kind of our latest endeavor of Round Window Institute. Nice.
It sounds, I just can imagine, working with the musician and trying to get it all right and the intensity and the attention to detail that you have to do that work.
A lot of attention to detail, not to mention lots of artists. They're artists. Musicians are artists and artistes.
Those damn artists.
Figuring out where they want to give up control, what's important to them and what's not. And people look at their own music in different ways. And my partner in this, a great musician named Adam Larrabee, who's a spectacular musician, he comes from a very academic perspective. And many people who play banjo play from a kind of folk music perspective. Mm-hmm. So there's kind of an interesting rub there. But part of our goal is to elevate the 5-string banjo beyond its kind of hee-haw folk music roots, which you can play all sorts of music on it.
Nice. Right. So that brings me into my next question. You've been pretty entrenched and enamored with bluegrass music for decades, and that's not the only type of music you play. Can you share a little bit about how you fell in love with banjo and the other genres of music that you play?
Sure. I was at University of Colorado, and I started playing banjo at 20 years old. And kind of the roots of bluegrass music are really the Southeast United States, and then kind of expanded in New York. But Colorado has always been far from the mothership and really had its own style. And so when I was 21 years old, I went to the Telluride Bluegrass Festival and saw Bela Fleck perform. And it just blew my mind. And I came home and was like, I want to learn to play banjo. And it just stuck. And so, it took me a while to find my way to bluegrass. Like that is really the fundamental technique that people learn to kind of get it together on the instrument. And so I picked it up then and kind of didn't put it down. I put it down some as I was a NOLS field instructor, and I was spending months at a time out in the field away from the instrument, but it's always been percolating in the background.
And how has that original passion for, again, attention to detail? I feel like with banjo, there's so many little nuances to it, maybe with every instrument. I'm not a musician, but how did that morph into the other areas of music that you play? Because
I was introduced to Bela Fleck, who plays lots of styles of music. I really just approached it as music, and as well as learning bluegrass, I'm really intrigued by Brazilian choro music, Choro. Uh-huh. I made a record of all music by the classical composer Bela Bartok, and that's what the Tiny Desk concert is on NPR. Bartok was one of the world's first ethnomusicologists, and so around 1905, 1910, he traveled around rural Europe collecting folk tunes. And then he would transcribe those and then set them with his classical training. And I thought it was a really interesting idea to take his classical treatments of folk tunes and kind of reinterpret them by folk musicians. So that sounds
brilliant. That's brilliant. Just in the first few minutes here, I'm reminded of what a great storyteller you are. Do you think that translate directly to your banjo playing? Like you have to tell a story when you're playing music.
That's a great question. I think many musicians, and probably many people out there, feel like they're not good enough. And I don't feel like I'm I want to be better. And lots of people beat themselves up about that they suck. And I certainly go through that myself. And I feel like, at least when it comes to like my improvisational language, I don't love my own storytelling, like just listening to a solo relative to some of my heroes, musical heroes, where you can really follow and be intrigued from step to step. When I listen to my own music, I don't hear that. So I think in some ways maybe as a crutch isn't the right word, but to counter that, I kind of built a story around Bela Bartok. Here's this framework for this music that offers a different context. And the record I did after that was commissioning classical composers, modern day living composers, to write for the 5-piece string band. And so that had its own kind of story where we could play long form, 25-minute through composed suite of tunes that wasn't dependent on me weaving a musical story of my improvisation. Whereas many musicians, you could just listen to Joe Pass play solo on guitar and you're swept away. So
yeah. Okay. Thanks for playing along with the game there about my observation and question about storytelling. So you've mentioned a couple times, I mentioned in introducing you, that one of the things that you've done in your lifetime is you were a NOLS instructor. And this actually ties into your defining moment, which we'll get to in a little bit. But since everyone doesn't know what NOLS is, can you describe it? Can you tell a story?
Sure, absolutely. The National Outdoor Leadership School, which mostly goes by NOLS now because it's international and not just national. But it was founded in 1965 by this legendary mountaineer named Paul Petzold.
Mountaineer?
He was a mountaineer. Yeah, he was the first man to summit, I think the first to summit the Grand Teton at like 16 years old in jeans and cowboy boots.
Right on.
And in 1965, he founded this school in Lander, Wyoming to train outdoor leaders. He felt like Outward Bound was kind of taking off. The Wilderness Act had been signed in 1964. And so there was more stuff going on. But he felt like leadership was really lacking. And so he founded this school to teach leadership. And they run from 2 weeks to, besides the wilderness medicine component of NOLS, like initially it was all field courses and it was from 2 weeks long, but really their standard is like a 30-day course. And then they ran lots of semester programs, all sorts of disciplines of outdoor skills, as well as they had branches around the world, do have branches around the world.
So I'm going to ask for a little more detail. So is it people just kind of going out in the wilderness and camping? Like, what are some of the things that people do when they go to NOLS, and who's it for?
It's mostly for younger people, like 16 and up, and it is not a therapeutic program. And so, like, I think being out in the wilderness for long periods of time has a therapeutic component to it that's inherent. But as an instructor, I was not trained in therapy techniques, and there's other programs specifically for kids who are challenged like that. So a big focus of what we did was how to camp and travel in the wilderness safely, how to stay warm and dry, how to minimize your impact on the environment, and kind of take care of your gear and equipment and take care of the environment and land safely at the end of your trip, how to plan those trips, etc.
Is that harder than it sounds? Because as you're describing it, if I didn't know anything about outdoor education or outdoor, I'd be like, well, okay, that sounds pretty simple.
It takes experience is the biggest, like anything. Like if you go out for a 5-day backpacking trip, having never camped before, and it starts to rain, you're going to get cold and wet and struggle to like keep it together and stay out there. And the more time that you're out there in the rain and having those experiences, the easier it gets. And also being kind of told, hey, you should bring this type of gear. We're going to use this. This is a great stove that's easy to repair. Here's how to repair it. So you can cook for yourself. A lot of the kids, they're kids, so they haven't really cooked for themselves. And the way it was set up, at least in kind of the 30-day courses, is we would break up into tent groups. The instructors camped together. And then there's small groups of like 3 or 4 kids, each in a tent with their collective food, and they would cook for themselves. They would clean those dishes themselves. They would set up their own tent. And so they're really it's practicing from day one how to do that as you might go home and do it with your friends in college or something.
Yeah. Yeah. I didn't realize that they were in smaller groups and then had to kind of fend for themselves not fend for themselves, but learn how to get these skills in small groups. I thought it was a larger group. As I think I did Outward Bound when I was a teenager, and a little bit of different structure. I'm guessing that when you're in the wilderness for at least 30 days with teens and 20-year-olds, many, I'm guessing, have not done something like that before, that you saw some transformation.
Huge amounts of transformation. So, the standard 30-day course, the goal at the end was to have the students travel for 3 or 4 or 5 days without instructors, like camp and just be gone. And so they would also be learning map reading and how to kind of navigate in the Wind Rivers, which was the Maine mountain range where NOLS started. And because I was living in Boulder, Colorado, that was kind of my home. Most of the courses I taught were out of Lander in the Wind Rivers. And then, and so you spend a lot of time off trail. Like I know there's a lot of mountain ranges that you really have to stick with the trail. It's either steep or it's too kind of wooded to get off trail. But the winds are incredible in that you can travel off trail almost
the Wind Rivers, you mean?
The Wind Rivers, nicknamed the Winds.
The Winds,
And so, we would spend a standard 30-day course. You might travel like 100 miles total, but that's with like big 50, 60, 70-pound packs. But, I'd say 80 of those miles might be off trail that we were just never. So we'd avoid people, any of the other regular tourists and horsepackers and people who are out there, we'd kind of avoid them being off trail as well. And so through that time, like every day is practicing and learning so the students could actually go off on their own for 3 or 4 days without checking in with instructors. And this was 20 years ago. And so we didn't have phones or walkie-talkies or stuff. It was digital-less, so to speak.
And that is when the kids or the young people returned, is when you would see the transformation? Like, do you have a memory of one of the biggest transformations you might have seen that you can share? Or just one that really stuck out? Doesn't have to be a big transformation.
To be perfectly candid, like I'm not that sensitive to those sorts of things. Like I would get I remember, one of the more challenging NOLS courses that I taught was in the Frank Church Wilderness in Idaho. I think it's the largest wilderness area in the lower 48. And it was like 100 degrees every day. And so we would wake up and we were hiking at 4:30 or 5 in the morning. And we'd have to be there by 11 a.m., to wherever we were camped. And then we would just like lay there wasted from the heat. And while that was going on, there were forest fires that were like increasing. They were huge forest fires in the summer of 98, summer of 99. I can't remember exactly. And so eventually we were evacuated for forest fires, but it was a really challenging course in all sorts of ways. That was a new area for NOLS, so we didn't have a lot of information on what trails were good, like how to kind of get around. And so it was a lot of exploration and figuring it out. And so it was physically taxing and steep. It was emotionally taxing because of the heat. And then the forest fires, and then the students, we actually sent the students off on their little small group independent travel at the end. And I think within a day or less realized, oh no, we sent them into forest fires. Like I sent one group going upstream and I could see like trees exploding on the ridge. Like running off and getting them and collecting everybody up, and we were flown out. But I got a letter from one of those students of just like what a, just life-changing moment. Like when she got back to regular life. It was when she realized like how transformational that was. But I don't know. I'm not that sensitive to those things.
I want to talk about that a little later about, I'll keep that in my pocket for now.
And I'm not sure, like, unless somebody shares it with you, is that something that you could really notice in somebody in a classroom if I was teaching, that, to just really see light bulbs go off in a way with just sitting there at their desk, or if they're hiking on their own.
Yeah. I think there's ways, but it's absolutely fine that there's not there was this one kid and when he was cooking eggs one morning, this thing, totally fine. All right. Time has come for you to share your defining moment. Go right ahead. You got the stage.
So it was the summer of 1989. I graduated high school in 88 out of Maine, small town in Maine. And I went to the University of Colorado for college. And as far as I knew, in 1988, gap years, people may have taken gap years, but it was not a thing the way it is today. It was not called that. And I needed a gap year. And my folks, the pressure to go to college was just, I wouldn't say it was immense. It was just expected. Like there was no questioning that. And so I went to college and I partied. If there was a lot of drinking in the 80s in high school, certainly in Maine. And as I moved to CU, that just expanded. And so freshman year was a mess kind of explosion of everything where I failed classes and not doing so well. I came back to Maine for that summer and I spent a lot of time with my best friend from high school who was going to college there. And I would stay with him and hang out with him. And he had a margarita party at his house there. And I remember they lined up 4 blenders where they're like seeing which one would, it's like, all right, which one's going to last the longest? And,
that's such a thing you do when you're 19 or
right.
20,
and what I remember
50.
is one of the blenders lasted basically one batch. Like they made a batch and they pull it off and the bottom fell out.
Oh.
But I remember, it's this old kind of colonial place in Portland, Maine on State Street that he lived. And I remember sitting down and this person like looking through her bookshelf. It was his roommate. And I think it was a woman. And like on top was a NOLS catalog, which I'd never heard of NOLS. I had heard of Outward Bound. There was a Maine Outward Bound. And I remember in high school, a woman who was in my class who did an Outward Bound course in the summer. And she came around and kind of explained her experience to various classes. And I remember thinking, I would never do that. I think the thing that really struck me was like pooping off the boat in front of everybody. But on the cover of this was a woman, a mountaineer, kind of probably somewhere in the Wind River Mountains with helmet and goggles and was like coiling a rope standing on this glacier. And I just was immediately drawn to it and started flipping through the catalog. And it was this, I'd never seen travel catalogs or mountaineering catalogs, anything like that. And I'm looking and seeing trips to Denali and 3-month trips to Mexico where you learn sailing and sea kayaking and mountaineering and, and travel around Kenya and climbing Mount Kenya and all of these, like, I didn't stop looking at this catalog for the rest of the night. I don't remember drinking any more margaritas. I just basically poured over this. And I said to her, I'm like, what is this to this woman? She's like, oh, you can have that. Like, and I took this home. I basically memorized the catalog. I looked and looked and looked, poured over this thing through the summer. In the fall, I brought it to college and I was failing out of college. Like things were pretty out of control in my life at that point, mainly due to substance abuse. And I met somebody who had dropped out of college. She just withdrew. Mm-hmm. And it was this eye-opening moment for me of like, oh, wait, you can do that? Like I just didn't, I was like I was in college jail, which I know sounds somewhat like a privilege. Like there's plenty of kids who go waste their parents' money on college. And I was one of them. I came into, my dad had a fund for me that was set up when I was really young. They had plenty of money for college and didn't know what I was doing and why I was there or anything. And so I get there and
margarita parties and
ball crawls and things like that.
Oh my gosh.
So I remember meeting her. I think it was basically like a Friday night. I met this woman who had dropped out. I'm like, I'm doing this. Or maybe it was Saturday night. And Sunday, call up my parents. I'm like, I'm dropping out of college and I'm going to go take a NOLS semester. I go in like, Monday.
What?
Go in Monday, sign out, and like, I'm done with college. And I kind of had to explain what NOLS was. And my parents were not that, they didn't really know or understand. But I think on some other level, like now when I kind of look back, I went to this great camp when I was young, when I was like after 4th and 5th grade called Chewonki in Maine. And
in Maine.
In Maine.
Yeah, it's a great place.
And Chewonki, one of the things I fell in love with there when I was 11 was river kayaking. And I was the youngest kid to ever do an Eskimo roll at Camp Chewonki. Yeah, and I came home, it's like there was no way for me to continue to do that. Like just in a way that today, like you could probably foster something for an 11-year-old kid to continue whitewater kayaking wherever you lived. But at that time, my parents didn't know anything about it. And my parents got divorced. And that kind of changed the trajectory of my life, at least at that time. it was hard to focus on that. But there was kind of finding NOLS was a coming back to this thing that was deep down inside me of being outdoors and loving that. And I called up NOLS in November of 1989 and said, I want to sign up for a spring semester. And they said, well, all of our semesters are full for the spring. We'll just put you on all the wait lists. And the first one I got into was the spring semester in the Rockies. It was started Valentine's Day, 1990.
So great.
And so, the real defining moment was finding that catalog. And years later, as I became an instructor, they had in the NOLS instructor library, they had a copy of that catalog that I hadn't seen. I had lost it. When I took off for NOLS, I kind of lost everything. Like I stored things in random places. All my stuff was just gone. Maybe I had a storage unit. I don't even know. Like I had my car and I came home and after 3 months and I put my ATM in the machine and it just ate my ATM card. I don't know. It wasn't that together at 20 years old. But I found that catalog, and so I don't tell NOLS, but I swiped it from their library, and I still have it with my things.
We're going to take a short break now to hear from our sponsor, Take Passage Coaching. This is still Mary, and I happen to be the owner and lead coach of Take Passage Coaching, and I'm thrilled I asked myself to be my own sponsor. Seriously, though, Take Passage Coaching is a trauma-informed, transformational coaching practice that supports people who are ready to move from uncertainty and doubt to the ability to clarify what they expect from themselves. At Take Passage Coaching, I work with clients to help them look at their negative thoughts not as the messy parts of themselves to stuff away, but how to use those thoughts as fuel. I know you've probably heard all of the promises before, and you may have been working on your stuff for ages with not much progress. But one reason why Take Passage Coaching is different is that I celebrate all of your messy parts, the parts you're embarrassed about, the things you may consider weaknesses, and I help you to see them that they are all gifts and they are all strengths. So whether you're someone who has experienced trauma, and if you're human, you have, or are ready to do the scary things in life that you've been telling yourself you can't, Take Passage Coaching is ready to help you with the transition and change that you want. So go ahead and reach out to takepassagecoaching.com to book a free exploratory session and take good care. So, a lot of 20-year-olds don't have tons of perspective, but did you have any inkling at that time that picking up the catalog might change your life? I don't think 20-year-olds think that way, but
no, it was more like just kind of a magnetic vibe that I couldn't take my eyes off or my mind off. I would read it at night just over and over and look at the pictures and dream. So,
and I love that you said magnetic, because I don't know how many people that I've interviewed have said, that moment, like there was electricity, or there was like, I felt it in my body, and then it kind of cleared the fog away. And it was, if you're lucky, like, this is what I want to do.
Yeah, in the fog of a margarita party. Right. I could see where this like bookshelf the size of a wall, like where this thing was in my mind's eye. And somehow that's like stuck.
And I love that. It was big for you. It was, what did you say? It was, and you didn't say energetic. You said magnetic, but it was subtle too. It wasn't that somebody committed suicide. It wasn't that your best friend got into an accident. Like, it was picking up a catalog off of a bookshelf or a table. Our defining moments sometimes are subtle. So before you talked about Chewonki, you weren't really super athletic or outdoorsy, I guess is really what I'm going for, before you did this semester.
I would say I was outdoorsy, but my high school I went to was very like varsity team sports oriented, and I was not. I sucked at all of those, and I never really realized, you can be athletic, like and do sports that were not lacrosse and soccer. Yeah, and I had bought a mountain bike sometime, the spring of my senior year of high school, and was exploring that as mountain biking was just kind of, I would have been 1988, like it was just kind of becoming a thing, and so I was seeing that as well as realizing like, I can, there's rock climbing, there's all sorts of things that are not team sports.
Yeah, I feel that so many young people don't know that just because they don't play sports doesn't mean that they're not athletic or that they can excel in different areas. So you go to NOLS, you start NOLS, you're in the Rocky Mountains. What transformation do you feel that you were going through? Did you feel like you were changing, transforming? Were you out there, or was it years later?
Oh, like right away, it pushed on some weird buttons.
Like?
The first section we did was winter camping. And leading up to that, I was a lift op. I worked up at Steamboat on the lifts and was telemark skiing that whole time, of which, in 1989, 1990, telemark skiing was pretty new as well. And so I was the first student that my instructors had ever seen who arrived knowing how to teleski. Uh-huh. And I had been at altitude that whole time and playing in the snow so I showed up like fairly prepared and in good shape.
Yeah.
And you do what's called a mid-course check-in or a mid-section check-in. And so the winter camping was, 16 days or something. And so on day 7 or 8, we meet up and the instructor's like, you're doing great. Like, why don't you come hang out with us and help us plan the route and come and be part of our decision-making, help be a leader, as the leadership training.
Yeah.
And I completely freaked out. I don't know if I had ever done anything well. Obviously I had, little papers in high school, but
Did you freak out because they recognized something in you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's
this?
Yeah. I spent the rest of the the next 8 days just back, being with my tent mates and doing my thing and not trying to rise above the rest of the group.
Were you trying to rise above, or it just happened naturally?
It just kind of naturally happened. And I guess that kind of freaked me out of I'm good at something that I had no reference for. I'd never winter camped. I just, it was all new. But the next section that we did was 3.5 weeks in the canyons of Utah, which I had spent a little time as well. I'd gone mountain biking there once, but I think that's where the transformation began to happen of I am good at this. I like this. I feel comfortable. And at the end, as we work towards that independent small group travel, at the end of the, I was voted one of the leaders and kind of took this group, and it was, so.
I find it fascinating that when somebody recognizes a strong trait sometimes in somebody else, that they're like, oh, hell no, I'm just going to make myself small over here, whether it's fear or I think it's always fear. So the transformations that you were going through, who was Jake before NOLS and who was Jake after?
I think that it was something I was good at that I'd never done. I'd done a little bit of it. Camped with my friends in high school. We did a little crazy drinking trip every summer on the Saco River and camp out at night. And so it's not that I hadn't done, we had an outdoorsy group and it was in Maine. And so there was lots of outdoorsy things to do. But there was something about being kind of seen and recognized that I just never, I was a B+ student in high school. I got good enough grades that my mom wouldn't get mad at me, and then I could do the minimal amount of work. I never tried to kick ass, and I never found things that I was ooh, I'm actually really good at this. I did things I was proud of. I made a wooden canoe in high school. I loved that thing. It was beautiful, but it wasn't oh, this is my gift. So there was something about just being seen there in the winter section of
I love that.
That was a little scary. Because I didn't know what I was doing. I'd never met anybody who'd done a NOLS semester or a NOLS course in general. I knew nothing of it. I found this catalog, called them up, drove myself up to Lander, looked at the map, be oh, I'm going here. I didn't have the gear. I bought what I needed, but I don't think there was a REI. And there was some mountaineering shops, but I just showed up. I didn't know what I was doing.
Yeah.
And then I totally did.
Yeah.
And that was what was really a confidence booster in a way that I just didn't expect and had never really had.
I love that when you said you were seen, right? You were seen for something. And yeah, it sounds like you kind of flew under the radar in high school. Not so much oh, I'll just, I'll do what I can so my mom doesn't get mad at me. It's knowing you a little bit, you probably could have gotten better grades. Yeah.
No, I was a follower and not at NOLS, we talk a lot about followership is part of leadership, but I was not thinking of it that way in high school. I was just following along, trying to be popular and meet girls and stuff.
Yeah. Okay. I think all teenagers. So, I had mentioned before that I did Outward Bound. And no, I can only remember one instructor's name. His name was Chris. He was the guy he was the oarsman for the whitewater raft that had all the food. And I think it's funny that I remember his name and not the other instructor's name. And then there was the other instructor who only ate her food with chopsticks. I remember her clearly as well. That experience in Utah for 28 days, that shaped who I am today. I really, truly believe that. Do you ever think that 30 years later, there are people out in the world that consider you as being a poignant person in their lives and perhaps a catalyst for their own change?
Yeah.
And they're like, God, I can't remember his name, but he really helped me, blah, blah, blah.
I'm sure I had that effect on somebody, various messages that I gave and talked about during NOLS courses. And I mean, at this point, you also mentioned in the introduction that I taught wilderness medicine for NOLS. And so I led field courses for a while and then kind of transitioned into leading these 2 to 10 day courses, teaching first aid for mountain guides and trip leaders. And as time went on in those courses, I actually worked harder and harder to kind of make it broader, like try and have a broader impact than just the physical skills of like, how do you stop bleeding or how do you build a splint? But the practice of that and how important, like how you approach learning something like that and what scenarios are and how that's applicable to practice whatever you're practicing. Because as I also played more and more music, I realized like there was such an analogy to practice and and how you practice to perform and what that means versus lackadaisical practice that would not be really practice. So I'm hoping I instilled some of that in people.
You got to practice.
Yeah, one of the things I would say, it was kind of my musician, Yo-Yo Ma, the great cellist, is kind of revered as this like gold standard of like, he's the Yo-Yo Ma, my friend, his tagline is like the Yo-Yo Ma of the banjo or the Yo-Yo Ma of painting or, we all know what it's like this portrait of somebody who's practiced and like kills it. And I would tell my students like, you want to be the Yo-Yo Ma of wilderness medicine. And the only way to get there is to practice like you're going to perform. And think about that. Like, especially if you're going to be doing first aid on a friend or loved one, you want to know what you're doing and doing it right rather than panicking.
It fascinates me. There's the subtlety that we were talking of picking up the catalog and knowing it was something that you wanted to do. And it's the absolute best thing and nothing's going to stop us if we're lucky, right? Do you buy into the ideas of it was meant to be, or was it dumb luck? Or, what do you think about that? Was this meant to be in your life?
Yeah. I don't know if I buy into that, but in some ways, like I never knew what I wanted to be when I grew up. That was not even through high school, we would do these exercises I remember doing some computer program in high school that said, I think it recommended that I was to be an actor, which I guess is kind of close.
Yeah, you kind of are.
Kind of close. And because within like my worldview at 18 years old, I didn't know anything about the banjo and I didn't know anything about NOLS, or that you could really be an outdoor professional or like mountain guides. I didn't know or understand that in any way, shape or form. So it kind of makes sense that I wouldn't have had a vision back then of what I wanted to do. And in some ways, I still don't know what I want to be when I grow up.
Yeah, I love that. I love when adults say that. Still working on that.
I've come to terms. It's just an amalgam of a bunch of things. Also related to that question is, as we speak, I'm actually I'm in Ridgway, Colorado, staying with an old friend from college who ended up like being part of my circle of friends. We have this group of friends that all moved in and out of this one condo that somebody's dad bought, and we kind of stay in touch. That's our college reunion group. And all of us are like, the way we all interconnected and all became friends from like different angles is though it was meant to be. Like I met this one guy, Eric, because he had a Sugarloaf sticker on his mountain bike. And we were both started as geology majors in college. And ends up, he met all of these other people who I also knew, but he met them not through me, like independently. And so it was a kind of meant to be way that our Venn diagrams crossed over. And so, while I don't know if I believe in some of those forces, some of that kind of makes me think that maybe we do.
Do you think 30 years later, your time with NOLS plays any part in how you parent?
Oh, Yeah, absolutely. In so many ways. From like little things like timeliness, especially like being on time was so important. I know we're out in the woods and just like whatever, but like we had so many things to do and like being on time was so important. And musicians are notoriously late. And I always prefer working with musicians that are on time. And I've, have worked to instill that in my kids of like, it's so important to be on time and never letting up. It's like, whatever. It's just, a couple days here and there or a couple minutes or a couple hours of like, no. So that's one thing. And then another thing is, just one of the core leadership skills at NOLS is called expedition behavior or EB. And it's really putting the group before yourself during the time of that trip or during that expedition. And so being a little more selfless in ways of like waking up and making coffee for your instructors. And it's a little different being a parent or like, when I look at my friends or myself, like in bands, that if you're in a band where it never really ends, it's hard to put the group before yourself because you need to find some balance. But I certainly tried to keep that of like, I can put on a happy face and be nice for this period of time of like, while we're on some trip with my kids to Spain, we're here for 2 weeks of like, I'm putting the group first and like, we're charging ahead and doing this until we go home and then we can kind of relax.
Ignore each other. Ignore. Yeah, I like that. I had never thought about where timeliness may come from for people. So it sounds as though your defining moment rippled out in so many different directions for the students that you were an instructor for your kids. It has spanned decades.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, throughout my musical career, all the things that I learned as a NOLS instructor, as a NOLS student and NOLS instructor and wilderness medicine instructor, like just all like leading groups of how it is to kind of put together these projects of making records or putting together tours and things like that. So,
and I'm curious if you have any ideas if you hadn't been drinking margaritas at the party and hadn't picked up that catalog, or if somebody sat down next to you right as you were reaching for it, and then you forgot about the catalog, like, what would you be doing today? Who do you think you'd be?
In jail? No.
That's always possible.
Yes.
Are you serious? I mean, right.
No.
If you had gone down
I don't think so. It's hard to say. Like, I may still have left college, but it was helpful to quit college in the middle of the semester with a plan for my parents, even though they were not approving, like to say like, here's this thing, take a look. But it really thoroughly defined like the remainder of my college and, that and finding the banjo as well, which is, while they're all in me and they cross over, but those are two very defining things in where and how I am today and who I am.
Yeah. I love it. Well, Jake Schepps, thank you so much for your time. Do you have any last words you want to share with the listeners about anything whatsoever?
Sure. I'll share my favorite quote.
Oh, good.
Which I use a lot. I think about a lot as I play music, and I would use a lot in my wilderness medicine courses, but it's from the great product designer Charles Eames, who designed furniture and like the Eames chair. If you Google that, it will pop up and you can learn about him. But his quote is, "The details are not the details, they are the product." And so back to what you were describing of like, I do, a lot of these kind of detailed work, like all of those details matter. And when it comes to like Yo-Yo Ma, it's not that Yo-Yo Ma the fact that he can play one of these Bach cello suites, it's that every note of the Bach cello suite is perfect the way he plays it. And it's those notes and then the phrases and so that was the same with
and the ripple and the ripple, how it all ripples out.
Yeah. So that's when I would teach students to build splints. I would just be the same. It's like all the details matter. And that creates a great improvised splint for a broken arm rather than if you throw a bunch of shit at the bottom. Sorry, can I say that on your?
Yeah, you can.
If you just make it in a lackadaisical way, it's going to come out like books aren't made of crappy sentences. They're made of beautiful words and beautiful sentences. So that's my favorite.
That's
quote.
Lovely. That is a lovely way for us to wrap up our time together. Thank you so much. I can't wait to talk. Me. Oh, yeah. And I can't wait to talk to you about other defining moments, like seeing somebody play banjo for the very first time. And if you got a similar magnetic feeling. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mary.
This has been Our Defining Moments with Mary McClements. I'm back next week with more stories of moments in time that changed someone's life forever. Please rate and review the show and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. If you have a defining moment and want to share, head over to the Our Defining Moment website at ourdefiningmoments.com and click on Share a Moment. I'm always interested in people's stories, and I may feature you on the podcast.